the Southern Railway, not to be confused with the Southern Railway of the UK, this is the United States one, maybe we'll talk about the UK once upon a time, was a Class 1 railroad that lasted nearly 100 years in, naturally, the southern United States. They would become notorious for astonishing success due to being consistently blessed with excellent management that knew exactly what they needed to do in order to keep the company afloat. Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse, and before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains just a little bit of Southern hospitality. And today, we are going to discuss the Southern Railway, their success and existence over the 1900s. Tell me if you've heard this story before. The Southern Railway was the product of a merger. I know, I for one am utterly shocked by this startling revelation. But, yes, in this case it is indeed true, although their earliest predecessor actually dates back to 1827 with the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company, who actually operated the nation's first regularly scheduled steam-powered passenger train, the best friend of Charleston. So that's a pretty decent legacy overall, though by the time Southern Railway became a thing, they were the consolidation of 5 different railway companies, all in the southern United States. The Richmond, York River and Chesapeake Railroad, the Richmond and Danville Railroad, Memphis and Charleston Railroad, East Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia Railway, and the Cincinnati, New Orleans, and Texas Pacific Railway. All these would come together to form, simply, the Southern Railway, and this idea was actually the brainchild of J.P. Morgan. See, what happened was, most of the railroads that were involved in making the Southern Railway were originally controlled by the Richmond Terminal Company, and they had a huge network of nearly 9,000 miles. But for a variety of reasons, the company failed, and they came under ownership of the J.P. Morgan, who was historically known as being one of the most successful bankers in history. He was an astonishingly wealthy individual. When he gained control of the assets, he had some forward-thinking ideas for how to reorganize things. He felt the only means of doing this was to unify a faction of its railroads under a single system, which resulted in the formation of the Southern Railway. And Morgan also believed that a healthy railroad was only possible by utilizing less than half of the former network, due to route overlap, and he was correct. That is something that a lot of mergers in general suffer from. When companies merge, sometimes they occupy the same space, and those redundancies, particularly on a railroad, aren't always a very good idea. Oftentimes they're just black holes that suck money away. So that was one of the first things that was done. The first official president was Samuel Spencer, and he actually brought more lines, but profitable ones, into the Southern system. And during his 12 years in charge, the railway actually invested in building new shops at Spencer, North Carolina, Knoxville, Tennessee, as well as Atlanta, Georgia. They also upgraded the tracks and purchased more equipment. He was very much about putting the company's money back, into the company, to build things up, to make them as efficient as they possibly could be, which was a very good idea with the early success they were having. And he moved their service away from agricultural dependence on things like tobacco and cotton, and decided to diversify traffic as much as possible. If they could offer to transport a wide variety of goods, well, that was just more money in their pockets, more customers for them to utilize. Though, sadly, on November 29th, 1906, Spencer was, ironically, killed in a train wreck. That was rather unfortunate, but everyone after him actually followed suit with most of his ideas. The one big advantage the Southern always had over everyone around them is that no matter what time period we're talking about, pretty much every single one of their leaders was very, very, very good. Their management system, their style, and overall practices were always forward-thinking, building up the company, as well as staying consistent. They were extremely good at managing themselves even through very difficult times, and as a result, they never entered bankruptcy at all, even through the Great Depression. They were able to stay afloat, even in the hardest of times. Under their president Fairfax Harrison, they actually acquired another line from Meridian, Mississippi to New Orleans, Louisiana, and that meant they had assembled an 8,000-mile, 13-state system. And that would last them pretty much until the end of their existence entirely, because they were good at building efficiency from the get-go. They also had a bunch of subsidiary companies that didn't merge completely with, but they still made money from them too. They trudged on through the Great Depression into the World War II boom, and actually, in the early 40s, they started acquiring their first diesel road units. They started dieselizing pretty early. They dropped all their steam locomotives by 1953, though some did make it into preservation, fortunately. That process was overseen by Ernest Norris, and the company became kind of a railroad icon in an age when pretty much every railroad was struggling. The Southern, however, seemed to be doing okay. Despite trucks and planes taking a lot of their customers away, they were still able to turn a profit, and that was mostly again because they always saw ahead. Rather than getting stuck and doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, they always tried to reinvest their capital into making themselves better, and that was highlighted under the control of one D.W. Brosnan. Brosnan pushed to add even more new technologies and improved operations again. He wanted to utilize computers to help control the trains, and he wanted to redo some areas of the trackage that were known to be bottlenecks to allow the trains to run much more smoothly, and therefore faster. One of their officers, Jim McClellan, actually once said that the company was one of the most boring places he had ever worked, but that was a compliment in this context. See, what he was saying is that generally, as an officer of a railroad, you're always looking for ways to improve. But in this case, despite McClellan being a well-respected expert on railroads, he really had no way of improving the lines. Like, everything ran really smoothly. He didn't have much to do. He couldn't even recommend new technologies. They were very quick to adopt things like centralized traffic control, and they wound up double tracking many miles of their main lines to improve efficiency there. Was there anything they did wrong? Well, not wrong, but L. Stanley Crane, who was their last president, did once say that there was one mistake they did make, and that was during the 1960s. See, though being born out of a merger, the merger fad that was going on throughout the 60s that resulted in so many new railroads becoming a thing, as many other companies struggled to stay afloat by joining forces with each other. Yeah, see, the Southern hated that. They really, really were against doing that with pretty much anybody. But in their defense, they didn't really need to. I mean, yeah, acquiring a neighboring railroad would have extended their lines, but they were doing okay just the way they were. And if they did that, that would be a risk. They would have to figure out how to manage those new lines, and those new lines might not be as profitable, and they may not be able to make them profitable. They might get dragged down by a merger, and we've seen that countless times, so they may have known what they were talking about, especially watching the Penn Central fiasco. However, L. Stanley Crane was starting to think that a merger, at least to expand their own lines, might be something the company should be looking into, and should have looked into a lot sooner. What they wanted to do was gain access to Chicago, and they targeted the Monon Railroad and the Chicago and Eastern Illinois Railroad, but those railroads wound up going to one of Southern's competitors, the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. That had happened before Crane, but Crane then tried to rectify the situation in his tenure by merging with Illinois Central, of all people, which probably wouldn't have been the worst decision. Illinois Central was well managed too. But that failed, and then he had to petition the ICC to give Southern the old Monon routes and the old Atlantic coastline routes from Jacksonville to Tampa by way of Orlando, among other properties, as a condition of the ICC's approval of the Seaboard Coastline chassis system merger in 1979. He wanted them to try to make that fair and was using that as an excuse to get access to Chicago. The ICC's Enforcement Bureau actually supported the proposal, but it was still unsuccessful for a variety of reasons. And this was a big problem, because the Seaboard Coastline and chassis merger was going to result in CSX. And they would be massive, huge, just an enormous competitor. Something that the Southern didn't think they could deal with by themselves. They really needed a partner. Someone with a long cherished history of being well managed, that was nearby, that they could work to get along with. Oh hey guys! Yep, we did talk about this before with my Norfolk and Western video. The Southern Railway did wind up merging with Norfolk and Western to form Norfolk Southern. The marriage between these two companies was actually a very, very good one. Like I said, they both had long histories of never having a bankruptcy and being extremely well managed and in similar ways. This sort of union was actually perfect, as there weren't really any disagreements regarding the way forward for the new company. The suits weren't fighting with each other, they were getting along because they all agreed on what was the best thing to do next, which they did, and now Norfolk Southern is the principal competitor of CSX. Now, in my Norfolk and Western video, I talked about how great Norfolk Southern has been, and at that time, that was true. But that was like a week before the East Palestine incident. Norfolk Southern is clearly going through some issues that I need to address. In fact, I checked, their stock was cut in half in value over this whole thing. That being said, I still think they can dig themselves out of this problem. They've made some mistakes to cut costs in really stupid ways, like safety, which I have never historically agreed with because it's always cheaper to maintain things than it is to pay for a ridiculously horrific accident. But in any event, Norfolk Southern is still around, and I really genuinely don't think they're gonna go anywhere. They occupy too much space for that to happen, and they still have a pretty big customer base. They will recover for this, and hopefully be better for it. People have also asked me to talk about the East Palestine thing, but the official cause of that accident is still considered under investigation. The NTSB has not submitted their final report, which is something I genuinely like to have before I talk about any historical accident, because I know plenty of you are going to point out that, well, we know what happened, and we might. You're right, we might know exactly what happened. Let's be honest, we probably don't know exactly what happened, at least not to the full extent. I'm sure that Norfolk Southern has significant responsibility here, but before I actually make a video about that incident, I need to know all the facts, and I just don't yet. So I am patiently waiting for the NTSB to get back to me. But back to the original Southern Railway, they were great. They never did anything like this. And they will always be looked back on with fond memories. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Pincher Kitson 131-232, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Brian, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, Hayden DeGrow, Master of None, Lord Hoth 444, Alaric Jaspers, The Baxter, That Guy with a Beard, Mark Holding, Lock Kraken, Murder and Drodesdall, A Person 723, DM Trouble Typhoon, Ohio Trucker 1, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Alfonso Lapuche, Royal Hudson 2860, Isurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Dr. Racer 78, and Matthew Wolf. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.